Hello everyone, my name is Jeffery and on today's episode I'm going to be reviewing a whiskey from Westland. Now the interesting thing about this whiskey is that it makes use of a specific kind of oak that is native to the Pacific Northwest region of the United States. That oak is of course called Garryana, or at least that species of oak is called Garryana, and of course Westland is the only distillery to really use that kind of oak to make barrels with. This, of course, being called Garryana, this release from Westland. And it is an annual limited release that the distillery puts out, and for the last 2 years, this, of course, being the 2019, at the time of this video, I was recording the most recent release. But since 2018, so the last 2 years, last 2 releases, they have been scaling back the amount of Garryana oak that has gone into the blend that makes up this whiskey and has made it more of a facet of the blending component of a little bit of everything that they do at Westland. Now, I know they also make a peated product. I mean, they have a peated wood or something. I'm forgetting. They have a special edition. This is more the one that I'm talking about, called Peat Week, that I am also a big fan of. So I do know that they have peated stock, and I think at least the 2018 might have contained some peated elements. I cannot say if this particular release does, although one can argue there is a somewhat of a smoky element to this at play. What I can say is that there are only 3,750 bottles produced for this year's edition, last year's edition, the 4th edition, let's just go with that, and that it was made with Belgian brewer's yeast. The blend is made up of whiskey aged from 44 to 75 months, which basically translates to a little over 3.5 years to 6 years, which is really decent aging for American single malt whiskey. And the blend of barrels used in terms of percentages from least to greatest go from 7% refill Garryana oak, 16% Pedro Jimenez sherry hogshead, 19% new Garryana oak, 29% first fill ex bourbon, and 29%, and this is what I think is very interesting, first fill ex rye, which is not like a ground-shaking, it's not like a ground-breaking maneuver using used rye barrels, but it's not something that you see, and to me at least, just the combination of not so much the ex-bourbon, but the sherry, particularly that Pedro Jimenez, which is my preferred kind of sherry, the new Garryana oak, as well as the used Garryana oak, to provide more of a subtle kind of influence in regards to the Garryana flavor. But those things brought together with that rye component is very interesting to me, just from a blending perspective. So let's talk about the whiskey. So to me, at least, off the bat, I do get like this kind of green apple skin thing on the nose. This it's a combination of flavors along with that green apple skin, but it's this slight feeling of, or calling back to, various grain whiskeys. Not that this is a grain whiskey. This is, of course, a single malt, but Irish grain whiskey specifically, and more so, I could argue, although I have less experience with it, Scottish style grain whiskey, Port Dundas. Although Port Dundas, if it had more of a citrus element, is what this calls to mind for me. There's pear in the equation. I've been getting this on a lot of different things recently, and that's probably just because I recently got my first bottle of this, and so I've been excitedly drinking it, and so it's a new reference point, so I'm kind of possibly overextending it in my mind because I'm just thinking about it, so it comes up mentally speaking. But take this with a grain of salt. I'm getting somewhat of a degree of like an apple brandy almost. Although even almost like a cored apple stuffed with butter and then like brown sugar spices that you would bake up for like a wassail. It's kind of almost something like that. Dried apricot. A specific kind of odd note. Orange juice soaked leather, so just like a strip of leather that you've poured orange juice onto, or orange juice has spilled onto for some reason. A slight grassy quality, so let's even say that, you know, the leather strip is in some grass on a nice, pleasant spring morning, and you've just poured some orange juice right over it. Almost like an orange creamsicle kind of a note. Now, of course, with malt, generally speaking, I'll get some kind of caramel note, and I do with this. Interesting is a note very reminiscent of tres leches cake. Tres leches, I'm very bad with the words. Honeyed cereal, almost like a honey bunches of oats kind of note, but with even more honey in the equation. Blackberry syrup, but more like a very simple kind of a thing, almost more like a jam. You've taken some blackberries, you mash them up, and then you throw some sugar in to where the juices from the blackberries is kind of are drawn out and form this natural syrup almost. Another odd specific note, tannic juicy fruit gum. Dehydrated blueberries kind of pulverized, and the fine mist powder of that. Cloves, but cloves that have been spritz with some perfume. More of like an old lady perfume than anything. Bittersweet dark cherries. Although it is approaching, and there is some degree of tart cherries as well, just not so much. It does lean more on the bitter side, I would argue, for me. Slight strawberry jam. Different, yeah, not different. There's this distant aroma of rye bread, I find. Just dry spice almost. General baking spices even. Like a cacao as well. A little bit of like a banana note. Slightly reminiscent of a rum barbacoa in that regard. A buttery croissant. The hard candies of coffee, but it's more like a coffee with creamer and sugar candy. Coffee candies, let's just say. Yeah, let's give this a taste. It does have that rye spice leather thing going on in the initial bit. There's a very immediate tannic tingle to the tongue. This takes a lot of the slightly bitter smells on the nose and really expands upon them to where, while there is a lot of sweet things going on in the drink, I would say overall it does lean way more into the bitter territory. And it does have a lot of interesting flavors going on, of course. I am getting more of that strawberry jam flavor that was a slight on the nose, slightly more present. A little more butter, almost like an apricot brandy to a degree. Second sip, there was more of like a floral burst, citrusiness to that initial flavor. More in the direction of green apple, but more like bitter green apple skin than anything. A very, 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 very subtle hint of coconut, although more like a coconut sunscreen than anything. Towards the end of the palate into the finish, there is this note that I can only describe as sherry-soaked ginger. It could even be like more of a candied ginger that has been soaked with sherry. Almost like a bitter coffee that is, how do I describe this? There's different varieties of coffee, different, like from different regions, and it's a coffee that is more floral, fruity, and just more like a medium roast almost. Easy drinking, but done very black. And maybe it's just come out, it's been, I don't know, the way it was brewed, it's come out slightly more bitter. It's like that in that regard in terms of coffee. But when I say bitter coffee, not explicitly the only note is bitter. There's this kind of papery quality that lingers and kind of hangs around in the finish. There's this quality of, as the alcohol vapors kind of go up towards the roof of the mouth, that reminds me of boat shoes. There is definitely something that is like the aftertaste of pipe tobacco if you've smoked a pipe really poorly. Also in the finish, there is this kind of shotlet, almost spread, I'm not quite sure how to describe it, but a kind of shotlet that has been seasoned, spiced with some cayenne and other spicy things. And in a way, you could argue there's also some things like stewed prunes, raisins. Of course, there is a decent amount of Pedro Jimenez in the equation, so that does not surprise me. Orange, bitter cherry, just really up front with that sip. It's creamy, but it's not overwhelmingly creamy. It is definitely an interesting whiskey that I think is one to sit with and really think on. A lot of these bready components that I really didn't go into, these just fruity components, all these bitter notes that really bring together a lot of disparate elements. Very delightful. I don't think it is an amazing whiskey. I feel like there's a quality to it. There's qualities to it where it could go further in some regards, and the level to which it is bitter kind of holds back some of the flavors, I would argue, and I think it could use potentially more Garryana oak if that was available, but I would guess that it isn't, just from how little they used. But if you can get your hands on really any edition of Garryana, I would say do so. Westland puts out some amazing things. I would recommend anything they put out, particularly their special editions, their single casks, if you're lucky enough to find those, or even things like Peat Week. But I've been Jeffery Patron. This has been a whiskey review. These are other whiskey reviews, and that's it. Bye! Okay.